Il senso religioso o l'esperienza religiosa è innanzitutto un fatto, un fenomeno obiettivo, un fatto reale, non è un'idea, innanzitutto non è un modo di sentire, non solo si tratta di un fatto, di un avvenimento, ma del fatto più imponente e più inestirpabile della storia dell'uomo. Più imponente, più vasto, che neanche il fenomeno dell'amore dell'uomo e della donna, che neanche il fenomeno del rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perché il senso religioso è un avvenimento che pone, che afferma o che ricerca l'orizzonte entro il quale acquisti senso anche il rapporto tra l'uomo e la donna, anche il rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perciò è più vasto, perfino di quelli.
10 racconti di solidarietà e aiuto concreto. Storie ricche d'amore, riscatto, coraggio e cura. Storie di persone che donano e che ispirano a costruire una società inclusiva. Una mano a chi sostiene. Storie.
Il senso religioso o l'esperienza religiosa è innanzitutto un fatto, un fenomeno obiettivo, un fatto reale, non è un'idea, innanzitutto non è un modo di sentire, non solo si tratta di un fatto, di un avvenimento, ma del fatto più imponente e più inestirpabile della storia dell'uomo. Più imponente, più vasto, che neanche il fenomeno dell'amore dell'uomo e della donna, che neanche il fenomeno del rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perché il senso religioso è un avvenimento che pone, che afferma o che ricerca l'orizzonte entro il quale acquisti senso anche il rapporto tra l'uomo e la donna, anche il rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perciò è più vasto, perfino di quelli.
Dieci racconti di solidarietà e aiuto concreto. Storie ricche d'amore, riscatto, coraggio e cura. Storie di persone che donano e che ispirano a costruire una società inclusiva. Una mano a chi sostiene. Storie.
civiltà dell'amore. Fratelli e sorelle, costruite senza stancarvi mai questa civiltà. Lavorate per questo, pregate per questo, soffrite per questo.
Buongiorno a tutti e benvenuti a questo
Good morning everyone, and welcome to this quite special meeting. The meeting is special because today's topic is not a common one. And the people who are here, our guests, are not ordinary or common at all, but they are extraordinary. They are talking about something that makes two different worlds meet, because actually the meeting is a place where different worlds come together, different stories that are the basis of friendship and perspective. And so I think that today's meeting has already started because Luca and Juan José didn't know each other before, but in the last hour together we have already discovered how big is this topic. We will talk about physics and literature. Two worlds that seem to be far away from each other, and they are, objectively far. We don't want to make confusion on this, but we want to, find the possible similarities, analogies, and the things that these two different ways of talking about the world have in common. We cannot, merge the two, but we are curious to understand the perspective of this meeting between the two worlds and what this can mean for our point of view on the world. So let me start by introducing our two guests. First of all, an eminent physicist and an eminent writer, but they both have a particular sensitivity on this matter. I have been knowing them. I have known them for many years. We are friends, and I know that this topic is very lively. This dialogue was, born from a real dialogue between them, from, an interest in this wide dimension that they both experience. Luca Doninelli is very well known by the meeting and in Italy in general because he is one of the main writers. In 1978, he met Giovanni Testori that became a point of reference for him. And Luca Doninelli recently wrote an autobiography that is entitled Una gratitudine senza debiti. It is dedicated to Testori, and Luca wrote several novels. Some of them have been awarded, and I will mention them La revoca, la nuova era, le cose semplici, that was awarded in 2016 with the Campiello Award, and the same was for Revoca in 1992. La Revoca, sorry. And Luca is about to publish a new novel. I don't know if it will be published in 1 month or two. No, a few days. And the title will be Nero Fiorentino. I think that we will all be curious to read this new work. Let me also say that Doninelli, together with Giacomo Poretti and Allevi, founded the Teatro Oscar, which is a very lively place in Milan. So once again, thank you, Luca, for being here. A big round of applause. Juan José Cadenas is a professor of physics of the Ikerbasque Foundation, Donostia International in San Sebastian. Juan José is one of the main experts on the physics of neutrinos, which are the least known particles in nature. His experiments have been awarded several times, among which in 2016 the K2K and T2K experiments received some, awards because they achieved important results on the oscillation of neutrinos. And we won't get into details, but they are really extraordinary. He was also the founder and spokesperson of the next experiment, an experiment which is trying to show a property of neutrinos and the fact that it is the antiparticle of itself. Juan José is also a writer because he wrote novels, poems. I'm not mentioning all of them, but I just say that there are 2 books that are about to be published. The first one is Itaha in English, a poem, and the other one is La terra della fine del mondo. So we are really honored and pleased to conversate, to talk with you. The dialogue has already started, and I would like to ask Luca to start this dialogue together. Big round of applause for Juan as well.
Allora, buongiorno a tutti.
Good morning everyone. I'm going to start from the curiosity that I've always had for a discipline that I only know superficially, that is science and physics in particular. During my education, science and literature were considered as 2 worlds apart, because science had to do with facts, and so the fact that they could be checked, verified, repeated, this is what was started at school, while literature had to do with, the human emotions, feelings, dreams. And then, as time went by, I confirmed the fact that this idea was reductive. Because, as you were saying, Marco, there are distinctions that need to be underlined. This is true. But I also think that there is an experience that, encourages a man to write or to make scientific research. And in the two, things, there are some common points. For example, reality is made up of a fundamental sadness, even if we try to hide it, to dissimulate it. Quid animo satis? That's a fundamental question. And it means, what is enough for us? Because, something new, something beautiful excites us, but they also create a sort of wound for us, because, they give us a sense of lack. And so both scientists and poets or writers have this in common, because in the past, one of the titles of the meeting was Be Realistic and Ask for the Impossible. And what I've always wanted, but I didn't have, what scientists did, is the fact of, setting a starting point and then making calculations, measurements. And that's the main work that I have to do. That is to set an intuition through an enormous work. But this is also what the poet does. It is exactly the same. At the moment, I'm reading a novel, and at some point there is an accident, a car crash. So a car crashes into a motorbike, and the biker flies away. And there's a child witnessing all the event. And then the child grew up, and as time went by, he realized how important the color of the car was, or the trajectory that the biker followed while following. It was like, fixing something that wounded you. And poetry strikes us because it is extremely precise, exact. The, best poet is the one who is not vague. For example, Leopardi and his poem, The Village Saturday Night, says, solea danzar la sera intra di quei che ebbe dei compagni più belli. And intra, in Italian, immediately tells what kind of dance they were dancing. It was the gavotta. And he also mentioned trees, and in particular poplars, and he said that they vibrated. And it's actually poplars that vibrate. So this is what strikes me of poets and writers, fixing the wound that reality produces in us, making it, a very difficult vision, because it requires a lot of work. And so, for example, the car that crashed into the motorbike was red, and that was important. And it was also important that it was a specific kind of red. And this is part of witnessing, of the testimony. For example, when well, let me say that I've always envied scientists and their work. And so I would like to ask two important scientists, only him? Okay, you can say something if you want. How do you see this? Because you also write novels, and you are not just a researcher. So how do you consider this intuition? Thank you, Luca, and good morning, everyone. Let me start by saying a couple of things. Let me start by apologizing for speaking an approximate Italian because, it's not a very good Italian. I'm sorry about that, but I try to. I do what I can. What you were saying is extremely interesting. The need for details, the fact that the car was red. It is also very interesting to hear you say that the need for writing comes from a wound that we have inside us. And when we talk about beauty, we always talk about pain as well. I started being a scientist for a wrong reason, because I thought that nature could give me an alternative to this wound, to this sadness. And for me, and for my point of view on the world as a poet, it was very clear that I needed to understand the human soul, the human being, and this meant understanding this wood, this sadness. And I thought of the universe. The universe was beautiful, was logical, a logical place. So I thought that understanding the universe could bring me joy, happiness. And the process itself of understanding could bring me joy. And so I could, avoid this wound a little bit. So I started doing science, not consciously, but, to find some peace, some tranquility. And I thought, okay, let the poets suffer and avoid some of this suffering. But I remember that I was very young when I decided that I wanted to be an artist, because I thought this was a pro with the girls. Yes, this is true. I told you that I wanted to be a scientist to find happiness. Instead, the reason for writing novels is that I wasn't very good looking when I was young. And so, I could say I'm not good looking, I'm not charming, but I can write. By the way, I discovered that the scientific knowledge could also give this kind of pain, this kind of wound. And it's a strange pain, because there is some pleasure in it. And also in writing, you have this pleasure. And when you start doing research, doing science, you are generally young and naive, and you start working without reflecting. You don't have time for it, and you go on and you work, you learn a job, you don't think too much. And then at some point, you remember that, there is something that struck you. For example, I remember that I was in Japan. I was 44. My son was 4 years old, and Paco Salinas, a Spanish poet, had died 2 weeks earlier when he was 50. So it was a very sad day for me. But, there was sadness, and there were the neutrinos. And so I had to deal with that. One night, I was on shift, and I was, looking at the neutrinos, and I had this idea. These neutrinos have crossed all the universe. The neutrinos that I'm seeing now in this point have been for millions of years around the universe. And now that I'm here on this planet for just a few years, I can see this kind of animals giving me a strange, mysterious messages, telling me something about the universe that is enormous, that is wonderful, and a universe that, doesn't care about me. So that tragedy struck me more than the novels and the other things that I was writing to please the girls. And that's the analogy that I find between science and literature. They both try to explain this beauty that strikes you and that hurts you. You see that, they have already started, this dialogue, and maybe they don't need me to ask questions. But I was struck by this idea of, pain and the wound. Maybe this wound needs to be accepted. Scientists and poets and, all of us, we are sensitive to reality, and at some point, this wound, the idea of something that goes beyond my control, something that is also beauty. So it's a wound, but also beauty. So at some point, we need to keep this open. People who are neither poets nor scientists, well, we tend to close this wound, don't we? Scientifically, if we think of the knowledge of the world and the dualism between wave and corpuscle, it's something that is a wound for them. Because someone imagine an elementary particle to have tranquility, peace, to understand something, understand that the basis of everything that are atoms, the elementary particles, and if we can understand it, we can understand how all reality is built upon them. So reality came to us, but revealed how false this idea is. So that's not in line with the image we have of a particle, and it's something that cannot be visualized. We cannot visualize what an elementary particle is. Because it can be a corpuscle or a wave. But let me go back to you. What do we need to keep this wound open? Because someone may say one of the two, either the wave or the corpuscle, is wrong. But it's the logic of the world, the fact of, closing to this, closing to have this closure. But a poet and a physicist have to accept this sort of, annoyance towards reality. Well, I think that this is the first input of any act of knowledge. There's a friend of mine, a great journalist, who likes telling things and telling facts, but he also spends a lot of time listening to music because he knows that what he says is not real, but he needs to say it because that's his job. Saying, you know, Biden did this, Meloni did that. That's his job. But, you know, the first answer that I'd give to your question is that for this provocation to reality to be open, well, we need to communicate it. The main characteristic of this anxiety, of this concern, is actually the fact of being communicated, needing to be communicated. In the past, I was professor of aesthetics at the University of Sacro Cuore. And generally, students told me that, you know, beauty is something relative. It depends on what people like. But I generally told them that the problem is not the object, because saying I like this or it is beautiful might mean the same thing. But let's think of the utterance. For example, I can say, I like Madrid. If I tell you that I like Madrid, this is a complete communication. You understand that I like Madrid, that's it. But if I say Madrid is beautiful, well, those who haven't been to Madrid cannot verify if it is true or not. For example, my friend Giuseppe knows the Prado Museum very well, and I would like him to be my guide there. But, you know, saying that something is beautiful is linked to its communicability. Dante, the poet, also said that the experience is needed. You know, because I'm telling you something and you have to have this experience to verify if it is true or not. If I think of my meeting with Giovanni Testori, well, this meeting came from an intuition that I had, and I met a person that was much older than me, a genius that really showed me the biggest meaning of that. So one of the first things that keep the wound open is the fact that we need an act of sharing. Beauty is not totally, you know, solitary, something that you do alone, but it is an experience that we need to share. Because, you know, we can say, okay, that's it, that's a corpuscle, or that's a wave, that's it. Instead, having this concern is something that we all have and that we need to share.
I like this very much, what you just said. I think that we can also turn to the scientific approach. the Doors, the music group, they used to say that there are things that are known, things that we do not understand, and in between them, we have the doors. And this expression, well, as scientists, as Marco was saying, at the beginning of the 20th century, physics was almost boring because everything was there, well explained, gas, particles, atoms. So it was very beautiful, but in a boring way, in a gray kind of way, like the big building of science. And then quantum mechanics arrived, and we started down the road towards chaos. And that period, 1920 to 1950, that period was the most productive period of that century because beauty lies in between what we understand and what we do not understand. In an area, in a space, there's a very clear space. We know about quantum mechanics. We can do experiments with that. We understand. The quantum theory of fields allows us to make calculations with that are very precise. But this naive idea of the universe as a well-ordered place, it's wrong. We see the universe and we understand there is a shadow that is moving there, that is escaping our understanding. That is where we find beauty. Quite similar to what you were just saying, I think. Well, from a different perspective, but a perspective that has a lot to do with what you've just said, I think we can find a synthesis of these two ways of seeing reality, that is the way of the poet, that, as Dante did, is able to trap a whole universe. And Einstein or Dirac, that in one equation, with very few signs, say something that we cannot say without a huge amount of written books. And after all those books have been written, that equation or that sentence in a poem says something more. I'm really impressed by this. I don't know what you feel about this as both a scientist and a poet and a writer. Well, this is very interesting, in my opinion, because the first, let's say, mystical moment in my life as a scientist was when I was studying at university and I saw Dirac equation. Dirac equation can be written in one sentence. It's 4 symbols. When you see that and you understand it, you see that that equation is telling you things, and you can develop what those symbols are telling you to understand the movement of electrons, for example, in an electromagnetic field from a quantum point of view. So the amount of information that that equation is providing you in a very synthetic way about the universe, about ourselves, is really impressive. We could write books to explain this. And in that period, while I was studying at university, I discovered haikus and Japanese poets. What is beautiful in a haiku that you cannot move a comma because you would change the meaning. At that time, I was obsessed with synthesis, thinking that the essence of science was writing in a single equation what God is thinking. I was a bit ambitious. So science is trying to describe what God is thinking in one equation, and maybe literature wants to do the same with a single haiku. Oh God, you stole my thunder. That's what I wanted to say. I think we can start from the bottom, right in the same way. Great artists, great poets show us that synthesis is something that you give. When I met the Pope on the 23rd of June, I previously visited the modern art collection of the Vatican museums, and the person presenting this collection to us kept saying that artists are important because they allow us to see what is not visible. And I immediately realized that that was not true, because what artists show us is what is visible, is what we don't see, because we are used to seeing things one next to another, or one together, one with another. We are used to seeing that after one thing, another happens. If a car crashes into a motorbike, the motorbike driver falls off the bike. So we are used to things happening in connection. But artists always show us that things can be associated, and are often associated, things that we don't expect. And this is what moves the artist, the poet. Because I'm thinking about Leopardi and his poems. There are many poems that, well, I don't think Leopardi had planned to write his poems. There was a situation, an unexpected situation, someone sitting in front of an edge that prevents him from seeing what's beyond that. And so he starts wondering, what I see right now, would this be more if I could get rid of this hedge? And so he refers to imagination, the role of imagination in our daily relationship with things. And so he thinks about the wind, the silence, and the voice. And he goes on thinking about eternity. So it's the amazement of things that reality joins and that you do not expect. In our daily life, we do not see these kind of connections. So if an equation can tell me about what God is thinking, that's because God is putting into my daily reality, my daily life, the elements of such an equation. And artists and scientists are those that help us stop and look at things. Pay attention, not run too fast, because otherwise we would never be able to understand what God is thinking if it's not God that is telling us there's a car, but it's red. You said something that you talked about paying attention. The artist has to pay attention to real life, to reality. A scientist, it's taken for granted that a scientist pays attention to what surrounds him or her. Nothing doubts a scientist when they have a theory or have an experiment. Nobody doubts that. But we have to remember that science is an approximation, just like my Italian, my knowledge of Italian, an approximation. But literature seems to be, you know, like a game. A poet can say anything. No, that's not true. A poet has to describe, has to be very precise and synthetic in describing reality. Otherwise, he's just, or he or she are just joining together words. And the same applies to the scientists. There's a connection also in the method that they use. You cannot be a good poet or a good artist or a good scientist if you're not obsessed with details. A method is very important. A method is not saying we do this, we do that. This is not what I mean. There's no manual telling you how to write a novel. And when you have someone trying to teach you how to do that, you have to be suspicious. A course for writing that tells you the beginning of a novel, an incipit, is done this way. You have to be suspicious, because if someone is telling you how to do it, what you're going to do following that will not be new. I forgot what I was going to say. So the strength in the work that an artist is doing is that everything is open. For example, I remember that once I was with a friend and he was telling me about Il Buon Governo by Ambrogio Lorenzetti. And he said, did you read that? And he said, yeah, sorry, did you see that? Yes. And he said, well, can you explain to me why at the center of this painting there are two areas? One of them shows a room with a teacher teaching. And next to that, we have a shoemaker. If you understood that painting, you must know why these two scenes are one next to the other. This is to say that the artist, the great artists, keeps the surprise of the synthesis for the viewer. So the attention is always very high. So if I get to understand what God is thinking, is because God has already told me what God is thinking. I don't know what else to add, but this is what we have to do. And we need to be very precise, because it's only that thing. Because the beauty of creating literature and of creating science lies in the fact that in literature and poetry, I do not describe, for example, Manzoni presents Lucia, his main character, telling us the way she's dressed and the way her hair is combed. So talking about the main character of his work, he talks about details that will be fundamental, because they provide material, for example, for anyone wanting to create the image of Lucia. But what is interesting is the fact that if I talk about a man walking along a street, the shoes, the shirt he's wearing, the hair he has, may change the future of that character. For example, in a painting, if I have a portrait, the work of art is not just the portrait, but also all the areas surrounding the portrait inside that picture. And that is the synthesis, because what you create around the face that you're portraiting, like the Mona Lisa, for example, we need to read the landscape behind the face of the Mona Lisa to be able to understand the value of the smile of the Gioconda, of the Mona Lisa. It seems maybe we are constantly talking about the same thing. Well, science can be done in many different ways. And it's a daily effort, which is not very romantic. You're spending one day in your lab and you're constantly working and working and working. But, so this is maybe a bit boring, but this kind of work allows you to gather data, to gather the points that you need to proceed. So the big progress, scientific progress, come from someone who's so obsessed with what he or she is seeing. Einstein, for example, had the same data as everyone else. He didn't have special access to data that nobody else knew about. Maxwell, for example, had the same data as anyone else. Friedman, the same. But they were able to take one step beyond everyone else, understanding how the universe is made, because they were obsessed with details, details leading to truth. And when I was talking to Luca before, he said, I was writing a novel, and suddenly I was at standstill. I stopped because I couldn't see how the story went on. Why? Because the color of a tie was wrong. And you were talking about the obsession of a scientist. But when we were talking about the comma of Flaubert, so this is a very common example that is quoted often, where Flaubert said, when he was asked, what did you do all afternoon? Well, I put a comma. And probably spending an afternoon to put a comma was not very pleasant. And then he was asked, what did you do the following morning? Well, I removed that comma. So just think, this makes us understand the importance that a single comma can have, or the importance of the color of a tie. Or Tolstoy spent 20 pages talking about how a sledge exited a door, a gate. Because we think that we know, but we do not. There's also something else. At the basis of scientific discoveries, there is something that I think is in common with poetry. I'll try to understand it with an image. So there is a Russian chess player who went mad. And in the last few years, he used to play chess alone. Because he was not playing alone, he was playing with God. He was convinced that he was playing with God. And this is crazy. When he says, I played with God, and we ended up equal. So this surprise that you don't expect, this crazy person playing chess with God, and it's a draw, it ends up in a draw. This is the secret that the scientist is aiming for, playing chess with God and ending up in a tie. Okay, we conclude here with Jacob and the angel, with the fight between Jacob and the angel. We have 8 minutes, but I think that this is it. I think we reached the top. So I believe we could continue, and we will continue this dialogue. It will not be concluded here. Yeah, and it is something new. So a lot of things were just touched upon. So I think that this is a very positive provocation for all of us, because through dialogue, a very free kind of conversation, we saw the real essence of every effort that we have to make to try and look at the world. And we've seen a kind of resonance. So we observe what happens when we observe the world. So we observe ourselves in action, in a way. Don Giussani used to say that. We observe ourselves in action. This way, we can discover the relationship and the nature of our relationship with reality. And we can uncover dissonances with different ways of expressing our desire, our wound, our pain, our beauty in our relationship with reality. When you want to unearth reality and discover it while it is emerging. And that is something that I can communicate with a mathematical formula or with poetry. And talking to you, I was able to see this. Sometimes we talk about interdisciplinary approach, and this is very boring because there's no depth in that. So we're not simply joining things, we are discovering the fact that the synthesis is the result of something mysterious. It's not a game that we play. It's in the depth of reality. So we just touched upon these depths. There's still a lot to discover in full appreciation of the different methods that we use. Because this is what makes reality so rich. And at the same time, we enjoy this common origin. So I would like to thank very much Luca and Juan for their contribution. I just would like to conclude by saying one thing. What you said is really true, so true, that we can find connections between literature and science, also when one of the two guests doesn't speak Italian. This is really impressive. It's a collective phenomenon of simultaneous interpreting. Second point. When I was young and I was trying to appeal to girls, this is something that we have in common. There was a girl that was really hard to please. She told me, you're a scientist and you're skeptical. And this idea that I was skeptical was scary for her, because she said, with your science, she said, it's your fault that the rose is not beautiful anymore. She was really angry with me and with all scientists because she thought that rose was not beautiful anymore because of science. And I said, well, maybe the rose is not beauty, but we have supernovas, for example, that are beautiful. And I thought I tried to write a poem about joining the rose and the supernova with a super rosa, maybe. And, well, I'm a bit looking at Shakespeare. Once the play is ended, you feel a bit of unrest. So when you talk about watching yourself in action, sometimes this may bring to a surprise because something that you don't like. Maybe that girl saying the rose is no longer beautiful was trying to protect herself from scary reality. A bit of Shakespearean, this conclusion, maybe. Okay. So we thank Luca and Juan José. And I'd like to remind you that this kind of dialogue is possible thanks to our meeting. It is something that we can all support. So as you know, there are different stations and points where you can make a donation. You will see them because they have a red heart. And you can, in this way, actively support this great thing that is our meeting. Thank you.
Civiltà dell'amore, fratelli e sorelle, costruite senza stancarvi mai questa civiltà. Lavorate per questo, pregate per questo, soffrite per questo.
Il senso religioso o l'esperienza religiosa è innanzitutto un fatto, un fenomeno obiettivo, un fatto reale, non è un'idea, innanzitutto non è un modo di sentire, non solo si tratta di un fatto, di un avvenimento, ma del fatto più imponente e più inestirpabile della storia dell'uomo. Più imponente, più vasto, che neanche il fenomeno dell'amore dell'uomo e della donna, che neanche il fenomeno del rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perché il senso religioso è un avvenimento che pone, che afferma o che ricerca l'orizzonte entro il quale acquisti senso anche il rapporto tra l'uomo e la donna, anche il rapporto tra genitori e figli. Per Perciò è più vasto, perfino di quelli.
Dieci racconti di solidarietà e aiuto concreto, storie ricche d'amore, riscatto, coraggio e cura, storie di persone che donano e che ispirano a costruire una società inclusiva. Una mano a chi sostiene. Storie.
Il senso religioso o l'esperienza religiosa è innanzitutto un fatto, un fenomeno obiettivo, un fatto reale, non è un'idea, innanzitutto non è un modo di sentire, non solo si tratta di un fatto, di un avvenimento, ma del fatto più imponente e più inestirpabile della storia dell'uomo. Più imponente, più vasto, che neanche il fenomeno dell'amore dell'uomo e della donna, che neanche il fenomeno del rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perché il senso religioso è un avvenimento che pone, che afferma o che ricerca l'orizzonte entro il quale acquisti senso anche il rapporto tra l'uomo e la donna, anche il rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perciò è più vasto, perfino di quelli.
Dieci racconti di solidarietà e aiuto concreto, storie ricche d'amore, riscatto, coraggio e cura, storie di persone che donano e che ispirano a costruire una società inclusiva. Una mano a chi sostiene. Storie.